How did you go with that first reading from Genesis? It was a very muted thanks be to God. In Hebrew, this reading is known as the Cate, the binding of Isaac. 3 Sundays ago, we heard the story of the promise to Sarah and Abraham of a child. Last Sunday and this, the story continues of now it's Abraham and Sarah and the promised son born to them, Isaac. Despite Sarah's not unwarranted skepticism, the God who promised the impossible had delivered. Last Sunday, although we didn't read it here, the story continued. And in that reading, Sarah demanded Hagar, Abraham's slave who had borne a son, Ishmael. Sarah demanded that Ishmael and Hagar be banished to the wilderness. Reflecting perhaps Sarah's fragile hold on the trustworthy reliability of this God, she acts to protect her own, to eradicate potential threat or competitor for her son's status. And then we have today's story. Abraham striving for faithfulness and keeping with what he here God asks of him to ensure the fulfillment of God's promise. As we listen to these 3 readings, it seems we can almost hear Abraham and Sarah's struggle to figure out quite who this God is, how to be in relationship, to do what is asked, to honour what is promised and delivered. Skepticism of God, jealous banishment of a competing heir and his mother into the desert wilderness, now the spectre of complicit infanticide. These 3 readings do not exactly reassure of the future of human nature or of the God who calls and demands and rewards. At least it could seem this way. Being human, we may not be too surprised that we see human nature revealed in this way, sadly but true. That such stories are part of Holy Writ. That Abraham, the patriarch who was pivotal to the story of God and the religions of the Word, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, that he is portrayed this way might make us squirm a bit. The disbelieving skeptic, the not so pure of heart exiler, the one willing to kill the only child born to him by his wife because he heard God tell him to prove his faithfulness, seem fundamental in this divine storyline. Through such characters, through such human characters, we learn of God. So today, we might be given cause to ask what sort of God would demand such a monstrous thing. Not surprisingly, this story in particular has been wrestled with by many fine minds over many years. Given that it emerges from the Judaic tradition, I thought I might seek some wisdom from the rabbinic tradition. The robust nature of rabbinic tradition means there are a vast array of interpretations. Apparently, there's an old joke. If you have 2 Jews, you will have 3 opinions. That came out of the Judaic context. That was what came from there. Anyway, it goes like this. Ancient and rabbinic explanations justify the shock and violence of this passage in divergent ways. It was simply another test of faith. God didn't mean it, having already assured Abraham that the covenant would continue through Isaac. More modern understandings say that it was a critique of the ancient Canaanite practices to sacrifice firstborn males. And then there was another one. Long before the moderns, an understanding is suggested by Rashi's 11th century commentary and buttressed by an overlooked line in the Talmud. God never actually told Abraham to slaughter his son, points out Rashi, but only to bring him up as if for a sacrifice. When Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son, he goes beyond what God ordered, and God's angel has to stop him. The Talmud goes even further and says that the thought of Abraham actually killing Isaac never occurred to the Almighty. So according to this, Abraham oversteps, goes beyond what God orders. Fortunately for Isaac, the angels step in. Yet, Abraham is being faithful according to what he knows. He is enacting what he knows this to be. Abraham is trying to figure out what it is to hear God and respond. He's learning what it is to be faithful, and today he learns how to fail. Maybe what actually gets sacrificed in this moment is the God that Abraham thought he knew, thought required this type of obedience from him. Interestingly, interpreters from the Christian tradition have seen this story as a precursor of God sacrificing the Lamb of Christ for the sins of humanity. But if we were to follow this other line of thinking, what if that never occurred to the Almighty? What if it went beyond what God ordered? When we hear biblical stories that are familiar to us, such as this, we get drawn in. Maybe we feel obliged to. It is the Bible after all. Maybe because we identify with the character, imagine it as ourselves walking this way. In today's unfolding drama, God appears as a protagonist with whom conversation is had, which is kind of cool, but it doesn't take much for God who's familiar enough to chat to become God who's pretty much like us. And from there, it's not too much of a stretch for us to come to expect God to reason and intend and instruct and think and behave pretty much as we do, to bring God to our level. Doing this helps us to understand and make sense of how God is in our life. It is much more comfortable to operate with a God we understand, who fits our world and within whose plans we're included. It's perfectly reasonable to use human logic to explain the inexplicable and attribute this to God. But if we dare to think that God didn't intend Jesus' death, even for the honourable cause of redeeming our sins, where does that leave us? How does that reframe God for us? When we tell the story of Jesus, God's Son, dying for our sins, do we not, in all likelihood unintentionally, create a God of infanticide or of self-sacrifice? It may be a way to make sense of what happened, make it easier to live with the guilt by displacing responsibility for what happened to God. Are we able to sacrifice our need for God to be like that? Are we able to release God from such binding? Acknowledge that however we conceive God, however certain we may be, however much we need certainty, God is always vulnerable before our imagining. Because we create God the only way we can, out of our experience out of our need, we have no other way to do it. And when we overstep to absolutes, especially if this causes harm or destruction of life, such God of our imagining may need to be sacrificed, like the ram entangled. I began my musing whether the story, the example of Abraham and Sarah, might be a story for us of how to figure out to be faithful, about how to engage in a living relationship with God beyond comprehension, yet who acts in real time. What it is to seek, to strive to be faithful and obedient and aligned with this God, and to recognize with best intention we sometimes overstep and we fail. Yet such failure may release us, and maybe God, from a binding and stifling relationship. It may free us to welcome the beckoning God, the living God that gospel today speaks of. Abraham searched for God, sought to know God, as I think many of us do. But I wonder sometimes whether this becomes a journey away from ourselves. We climb mountains, we traverse vast territories to prove that we're willing and worthy and sufficiently faithful to receive God's blessing and beneficence. That God we seek is always somewhere else, something else, other than us. As if it's impossible for us to discern the divine here, with us, in us, as we are. To slow long enough to discern the welcome and to receive the gift of God with us.